In December 2014, the city of Indore was locked in a brutal winter freeze. For a college student named Rashmi, the cold was the least of her worries. A sudden phone call shattered her afternoon. Her brother, Deepak, had been in a severe motorcycle crash. Deepak was rushed to the nearest ICU, his body battered and barely clinging to life. His injuries were cataclysmic. Yet just hours later, doctors delivered impossible news. His vitals stabilized and Deepak was sightly out of danger. But the relief was short-lived. When Rashmi visited his recovery room, Deepak was cheerfully humming a tune, his eyes locked in a dead, unblinking stare. Without a word, he dragged his broken body out of bed, limped to the open window, and stepped out. Rashmi screamed for help, yet when the nurses burst through the door, Deepak was standing perfectly still inside the room, as if the jump had never happened. The doctors dismissed the bizarre event as trauma-induced psychosis. Desperate to get him out of the ward, the family heavily medicated him and discharged him. They believed taking him back to a familiar environment would cure his mind. Instead, they were carrying a volatile, unseen threat right through their own front door. The physical shift from the sterile hospital to their childhood home felt like a victory. The family locked the doors, assuming the thick, familiar walls of their house offered absolute protection. That illusion fractured almost immediately. Deepak planted himself by the living room window. He refused to sleep, spending hours staring into the darkness outside, tears streaming silently down his face. When Rashmi finally asked what he was looking at, Deepak raised a trembling finger. He pointed directly at their mother. But as they followed his gaze, they realized he wasn't looking at her. He was pointing at the empty space hovering inches behind her shoulder. He leaned in close to Rashmi and whispered a single, terrifying sentence. "She came to take me." To Deepak, the entity was fully visible. It was coalescing right there in the living room, hovering intimately over the person who gave him life. The perceived safety of their own four walls was gone. The thing staring through the glass was no longer a distant medical concern. It was now a permanent fixture in their living room. Having breached the perimeter, the entity began to claim deeper, darker territory within the floor plan. Later that evening, Rashmi found the living room empty. Following a strange noise, she tracked her brother into the kitchen, finding him curled into a tight ball in the pitch-black void directly beneath the sink. In the dark, a loud, hysterical laughter echoed off the tiles. When Rashmi begged him to stop, he replied softly, "I'm not laughing. She is." Deepak was still there, but his voice was being used as a mouthpiece for something else. The laughter under the sink didn't belong to a brother. It belonged to the intruder. Terrified, the mother consolidated the family into her own bedroom. She heavily sedated Deepak with sleeping pills, hoping that keeping everyone within arm's reach would create a physical barrier against the terror. In the dead of night, Rashmi jolted awake. Something rough was wrapping tightly around her ankles. In the dark, someone was systematically binding her feet with a coarse rope. She kicked out, her eyes adjusting to the shadows. It was her brother, but his familiar blue eyes were gone, replaced by a harsh, unnatural red glow. Before she could scream, a violent fistful of her hair was yanked backward. Her own brother was dragging her across the floor. The pain forced her eyes shut. When she opened them a second later, the rope was gone, and the room was dead silent. But as she turned her head, her blood ran cold. Deepak wasn't there. Instead, an unknown, ghostly woman was lying motionless right beside her in the bed. The boundary between what was real and what was haunting them had dissolved. The threat was no longer limited to Deepak's outbursts. It had taken its own shape, invading the most private corner of the house to wait for Rashmi in the dark. The family's final stand occurred at the most exposed point of the property. The silence of the night was suddenly shattered by guttural screams coming from the rooftop. They rushed upstairs to find Deepak pacing the ledge. He wasn't talking to them. He was deep in conversation with the empty air, repeatedly calling the unseen presence Priya. Spotting his terrified sister, Deepak's face twisted into a grotesque smile. In a distorted, mocking voice, he asked Rashmi how her ankles felt, and if she had enjoyed her late-night introduction to Priya. When their father lunged forward to pull him from the edge, Deepak swatted the grown man away with a single hand, sending him crashing to the concrete. Then, emitting one final, earth-shattering shriek, Deepak collapsed. The violence ended as abruptly as it began. Deepak slumped to the roof, his strength spent, leaving the family in a deafening silence at the highest point of the house. By morning, the family abandoned modern medicine. They bound Deepak to a chair and brought in a pundit, shifting their strategy to a spiritual extraction. The pundit explained the crash wasn't just a physical accident. At the point of impact, trauma opened a doorway. Geographical overlap revealed a woman named Priya died violently on that identical stretch of road. Hitting the pavement, she found a vessel to leave purgatory. The pundit performed an intense cleansing ritual, successfully severing Priya's hold on Deepak's physical body. But the structural damage to their lives was permanent. The house they grew up in was irreparably tainted by the memories of the haunting. Recognizing the space was ruined, the family packed what they could and fled. They relocated completely, abandoning their home for the anonymity of a dense, bustling city, desperate to surround themselves with the safety of daylight and the living. Deepak eventually recovered his sanity, but his ordeal proves a chilling reality about human survival. Enduring a violent brush with death doesn't mean you've escaped it entirely. Sometimes the most lethal threat is the invisible trauma you unknowingly carry across your own front threshold.